things about China. Uh, so, Ibrahim, were you there? Yes. So, thank you very much for watching that. And let's start with the lecture then on that. So, this was a matter of life and death, a secret pact signed by all. Choose to live or die and embrace economic individualism or sure starvation and death. Now, economic individualism, by the way, individualism, that's what Adam Smith talks about. And that was exactly what these farmers were deciding to do. They were taking matters into their own hand. They were no longer going to do exactly as they were told to plant things, and then they would they would work hard at it and share whatever was over the quota that they had to turn in. And it was amazing the results that happened. So So let's start on that then. So Shaogong Village, it was a catalyst. Anhui Province in 1978, 18 farmers signed a secret agreement to pledge if any were jailed, executed, or died, the living members guaranteed their families safety and care. They were dividing up community-owned farmland into individual plots called households contracts, risking their lives by so doing this. They began China's rural revolution, setting an example for 1978 and 79 rural reforms to increase farmers' incomes, allowing rural laborers to start private community businesses. So the goal here was that rural reform sought to increase added value to land through its transfer and distribution. It facilitated transition from communism to build on a market-based privatized economic system. Deng Xiaoping had taken over at that time, and he was very much involved with an experiment that was taking place with capitalism. No one would ever have thought this would be possible, that mainland China, a communist country, would willingly accept capitalism, but it was happening. So the legacy and the new system, Shaogong, birthplace of China's rural reforms, was first to use the household responsibility system, where land leased to families delivered fixed output quotas, and they were naturally increasing over time. Deng Xiaoping praised them and began his 1979 rural reforms based on what he saw happening in that village. And that started China's rural capitalism. And that next year, the grain production was extremely high, 148 tons more than normal. And after that, decades of rural reform, come 2017, the crop yielded 750,000 tons. That was an increase of 5 times greater 40 years later. And then also the farmer that's talking in the video, he basically contributed 10,000 kilograms of grain that first year, and then in 1979 they made the agreement in 78. So in 79 was the first year. He yielded 65,000 kilograms. That exceeded the total of the previous 5 years that he had got out of that same plot of land. So those were quite amazing results. And the per capita income went from $3 US to $50 US, and it was about 18 times more. So it was really incredible what happened, and it all happens spontaneously. It was a grassroots invention, and within 6 years or 8 years of that, they had closed the communes so that they could institute this method. As much as 96% of a lot of these production teams on the farmland, they had bought into the same system and were using it. So the benefits and results were great on this. Rural laborers were enabled to start local businesses and profit from increased growth and income. Shaogang's example of success and prosperity was repeated throughout rural China. And This came on the back, more or less, of what had just passed in recent decade. The Great Leap Forward was disastrous for rural areas. Half the village died. In Anhui province, in this village they were in, half of them died. And in the province, 1 in 4 people perished from a famine that was because of the quotas that they were supposed to meet were never met, and they falsified the information. And by so doing, that allowed the head of the communes to take away more food for the cities. And that's why they ended up starving in the countryside, because they were falsifying the records on the production. And a lot of the yield was being taken to the cities. So party officials knew that the system and rural laborers, everyone, they were in desperation for a new development. And this happened in Shaogang village. So China, the definitive economic miracle. Now, China is the world's biggest importer and exporter. It's a new development in recent years. But in 1970, a poor, largely rural population, of which at least 30% lived in dire poverty, and even traditionally before 1949, 80 to 90% of China was usually rural. That's where the changes should start. So since you had the most population there. So in 1978 to 79, rural reforms began to set the grid for major economic changes. But bottom line, it was still a one-party system that would hold power. So agricultural first. So why was that? Because rural capitalism always precedes industrial capitalism. In all these countries that have ever gone that way of capitalism, it's happened that way. It was a fatal mistake for Mao to try to reverse the trend which led to famine. He tried to institute an industrial revolution before he did with the rural change. Okay, the most important factor being in starting in rural and then moving to industrial was that the land rent mechanism has to be established. And why is that? Because the key is to strengthen property rights and incentives so individuals can benefit from their labor and time invested. Then free openings and connections to markets. Once they were freed and people were allowed to use open markets, the rest happened naturally. When people have ownership, also known as skin in the game. A good reason the Chinese have been so successful is they lease land out. That's their form of ownership for the most part. Remember what happened in Hong Kong. All of a sudden, 99 years later, the lease was up and England ceded Hong Kong back to the Chinese. So many have bought buildings in China, and the government still has eminent domain, and it's not sure exactly, things change all the time. In China, they'll change one thing, then they'll reinstate it, then they'll change it again. So when a lot of these reforms were taking place, a lot of that was still going on. So China joined the World Bank and the IMF. Now, China used loans for one of their most important reforms, the special economic zones. And the IMF and the World Bank gave them help with that. So special economic zones provided on-the-job training on how to run a productive economy and a means to develop a new manager class for capitalism to take hold. So in the 1990s boom that started later after that, foreign direct investment money, they call it FDI had access to China's cheap labor force. So that started the Great Migration, so that China unleashed a newly trained manager class, those that were developing in the economic zones. They were sending them out of their apprenticeships there in economic zones to begin their new economic miracle and new brand of capitalism as manufactured to the world. So stock markets even opened later in Shanghai in the late 80s and the early 90s, I believe. So and that time, more FDI, the foreign direct investment, was coming in for coming decades of high growth. By then, China began to seriously consider a poverty elimination agenda. It wasn't always they had it, it was their intention, but they were desperately trying to to get things going after all these mismanaged and economic disasters that happened under communism with them. But by then, China, as I said, they began their poverty elimination agenda. When it was already underway from the Great Migration, basically headed east, eventually 500 million, then up to 800 million by 2019, were lifted out of poverty in China and surrounding areas. Compared to the rest of the world that only lifted nearly 100 million out of poverty, it was indisputable also when the World Bank confirmed that figure of 800 million. And what about the other economic miracles that we've seen, like Germany, Japan? Why does capitalism have so many economic miracles? And are we running out of locations for new economic miracles? Well, the global economy has come to depend on them. That's the real story. Basically, like they depended on Germany and Japan after and post-war period, they're depending on China now as well. So understanding the political economy of China's hybrid state capitalism. Now this is not an easy task. It's kind of unusual to sort of synthesize two things together that are almost entirely opposite. And unfortunately, that's how it's been made to think that, capitalism could not be instituted along with socialism. I mean, the Swedes sort of proved it wrong. They proved that it was possible to have a third way. So we have yet to see how the Chinese will prove it. We have a pretty good idea after the last 4 decades, though. Okay, so providing a framework for understanding is important in this case. For instance, China transformed from a state-owned and controlled economy to a political economy of state capitalism, state-supervised and regulated, combined with market mechanisms. Now that would, so market mechanisms, I will point out now, in case you're not sure what that is, it means the forces by which demand and supply determine prices and quantities of goods and services offered for sale in a free market. So China was operating on market mechanisms rather than on a planned economy. So understanding how those two competing systems can meld together, make sense together, and until we view them in that context, it's going to be very difficult to understand China also, because we have to look at it from their own cultural institutions and their own point of view. And the unique nature of the Chinese state capitalism is best conceptualized from different perspectives. The main perspective is one of viewing, the first one. So China as a civilization state, it should be viewed as such, as opposed to a Western nation state, to better understand Chinese model and political culture and rationality. You have to take into effect their Confucian influence as well. So as a response to that, Confucian should be considered, would need to be considered to help to have a better understanding through viewing the culture. So examining, so resilient capacity of Chinese culture and the one-party state to synthesize foreign ideas and practices, always with a time element involved, which basically means it's going to take a long time. Nothing is going to be moving fast. And the word synthesize, by the way, that simply means it implies the process of transforming any foreign idea, value, practice, and international relations into Chinese in character, or to change or modify them with Chinese influences, such as the Sinization of a political term and any concept, Sinization of socialism, Sinization of capitalism also. In other words, they would have to find the model that fit them best. And that's still ongoing, it's still happening. So another way to look at things is through historical evolution and factors. And by the way, I wanted to point out a few things here in these pictures. So you can see in Shaogong village, they have like 8 people towing a plow there. And then also these, most of these were taken during industrial revolution, or or not industrial, but the cultural revolution, and then right after that. So you can see in what need they really had to, or they, you can see actually when they installed capitalism, it was surprising. It worked really well and from the beginning. Okay, so here's another way to look at things. And this view, this is from the work of a sociologist, David Wank. And what happens is that looking at this from a historical and evolutionary factors, Chinese state capitalism is best understood in the context of China's centuries-long dramatic transformations. And these, it's very hard to figure out how they can even do it with all this in this background that they have. So state and society transformed from an imperial monarchy to a short-lived republic, then from a weak and decentralized warlord authoritarianism to a centralized revolutionary socialist state. So the answer to this, when you view it, is that's quite a resume for political transformations. We need more time to review it, and understand this for sure. Economically, it experienced a state-led industrialization based on planned economy and socialist egalitarianism to an all-around structural reform based on market mechanisms with rising inequality. Now that's a tough one. So, we really have to be very sympathetic to try to understand how they can make changes with all this background that they've had before. So, and then ideologically, the Chinese value system, the third point, the Chinese value system underwent transformations from feudalism to socialism and from collectivism to individualism. And again, we see that they've been through a lot, and there's a great deal of understanding that's called for. Now, if you take a look at that diagram there, it shows those different phases to make an understanding from. So this figure actually is a holistic approach that helps explain transformative socio-political changes of China from an imperial civilization state to the market-driven state, emphasizing importance of seeing transformations from its retrospective, historical, cultural, and political characteristics. Now, it indicates the fact of a challenge and response dynamic in China's socio-economic and socio-political transformation, which in recent times was assisted by resilient hegemony of the party state within politically and culturally defined norms and values. So another thing to understand is that when you look at China, here you see this map that we have in the center, and basically you see Chinese provinces take on the label of a country. In other words, these Chinese provinces have the same GNP as these 23 different countries. So imagine, ruling 23 different countries. And also, it's not very far-fetched because there are a lot of minorities and indigenous people still living in China that have to be considered in that mix. In these Western provinces, everywhere in the gray that you see, and more to the south as well. And once again, try to understand 23 different provinces, where some of them are all of them have different cultural, they're diverse with different populations and customs, and in each region and province. And the implication of this is really kind of stunning, because as China builds a network of big data from all of them, properly collected and managed, it can lead to major discoveries in technology, science, medicine, urban planning, government policy, economics, social organization, and society. And much of that is ongoing now. So the other note, I want you to see the map to the very left of the screen here. And you're going to see that orange dividing line that runs all the way from Manchuria in the north down to the border of Tibet there in the south. And that is called an isoyet, which I didn't know until I did this research either. And that's everything to the right of that orange line to the eastern coast has a 15-inch rainfall per year, and that's denoted by that isoyet. And that's along that wealthy coastal belt as well. There are 600 million Chinese between the coastal belt and that isoyet, and most of them still living somewhere around $2 a day or less, and another group living between $2 to $4 a day. Now these figures were from probably about like 5-6 years ago, so it may not be exactly the same, but still pretty close to it. And also at that rate where they were living, that's less than the same living standard as the country of Bolivia. So then also on the right side, you'll see China is divided up into 5 different color schemes there. And that indicates the traditional sections that are always referred to as part of China. And the east is yellow in the map, the west is green, the north is a lavender color, the south is orange, and the northeast is blue. And to get a true picture of this area, you also have that isoyet as well, which gives you quite a different picture than we see in most things with China. Most of what we see as China nowadays is all along that coastline from the China Sea there, where you see Spain, Poland, Malaysia, Canada, and similar levels of gross domestic product for those states in that area. Okay, so I want you to see one other thing here as well. And this is another map which shows 35 different Chinese cities with economies as big as countries. And I mean, that I found really to be mind-blowing, because there's 35 countries, 35 different cities there that are on the same level, and you can see them with the maps as well. One city there, Wuhan, Wuhan's is famous now. It has the same economy to the city as the whole state of Israel. And then other ones like here, Beijing has an economy very much the same level as the United Arab Emirates. So that is another interesting aspect about China. And then on this section here, there's a well-defined social structure. This new slide, well-defined social structure order in the empire social system. And this was a Confucian state ideal, which was very rigid, and it was a collective of a structured, orderly society. And it always had the emperor as the capstone at the top, and then 4 different groups below him. So the emperor was right below the emperor was a highly trained bureaucratic scholar administrator. They maintained the social order. It was a class of them. And next came the landed gentry and small lot farmers who kept empire granaries full. Then artisans and manufacturers who required official permission to make innovations if they wanted to make anything new or different. And then right on the bottom, believe it or not, is merchants and entrepreneurs. They were the lowest class in empire society. They provided goods and services, but not entrepreneurial innovations. They were banned from government office, horse riding, and even wearing expensive clothes at times. In other words, you wouldn't want them to show up at a state affair looking dressed up better than the emperor. So regarded as a threat, they would accumulate wealth for their own use, which might not match those of empire, and were outside existing feudal establishments' control. Now, there was no such thing in this four-class structure society as an innovative entrepreneurial merchant class that ever existed. Chinese inventions, although impressive, seldom were technologically useful. The entrepreneurial merchant class did not exist to shape inventions into products to make money. It never happened. No consumer culture ever existed to require it. And you see this same social structure, it carries over today to the Chinese flag, which was used ever since 1949, which was when Mao Zedong took over control of China. So the red color, of course, it stands for China's Communist Revolution. And then there's one large star and four small yellow stars. So you guessed it, the large star would be the emperor in the olden days. But of course, nowadays it's considered as the Chinese Communist Party. And then the four small stars, probably you guessed it right again. They are the traditional four class levels of society in traditional Chinese society. So you see, that was Confucius was here more than 1,000 years ago, but still you see his effect on the society and the culture. So A Tale of Two Reforms. Now this is from a book, and you see it up in the upper right-hand corner when you look at it. And it was how China became capitalist. And it's very well written. And one of the authors was a Nobel Prize winner in economics. So let's look at A Tale of Two Reforms. The post-Mao early reforms. So one of the reforms was from grassroots initiatives formed by a privatized sphere to save the economy. The other, Beijing design, was to revitalize and save Chinese socialism from near bankruptcy. State-led reform in two phases. First, at the end of 1976, and that was when Hua Gufeng, who was Mao's successor and an economic modernizer, he took over, arrested the Gang of Four, consolidated power, and ended the Cultural Revolution. So a big push industrialization, also known as the leap outward, was started. And with Deng Xiaoping and other support, Hua launched this economic program of modernism, a state-led investment-driven program focused on heavy industry, and it barely lasted over 2 years when called off early in 1979. From its own defects and also from a leadership change. At the end of 1978, at the Central Committee meeting, Deng Xiaoping and Chen Yun were back in power, and they dismissed Hua and his plan. And with the Chinese economy then it was structurally imbalanced. So with too much heavy industry investment relative to light industry and agriculture, the state sectors in planning was emphasized to the exclusion of private sectors and markets. So even back then when they started up, they still didn't know how to put in private markets, private sectors and markets. They were still experimenting with that. So Hua's economic program focused on heavy industry. It had made the economy worse. And that's when Chen abruptly ended it. And this was against, of course, the state council's, the state council was directly opposed to this, but they acquiesced and agreed to implement his economic policy. So suddenly you have a second round of Beijing-led reform suddenly on board. So Chen's state-led reform plan, it was twofold. The adjustment would be made at a macro level, and then also at the SOE, those are state organized enterprises.
State-owned.
Thank you. Right, state organized enterprises, and those would be done at the micro level. Now the structural adjustment, it went across the economy. So investment was channeled from capital goods to consumer goods. So let me give you the difference on those two. So capital goods and consumer goods are classified by how they're used. A capital good is used to help increase future production. Consumer goods are consumed and have no future productive use. So they were trying to start up a consumer society a little bit to get things going where things could be manufactured and sold to the population. And nothing better to do that than a consumer society. So major new adjustments were made. Beijing was decentralized. Beijing decentralized foreign trade, and which give them more fiscal autonomy, and then also to provincial governments. So on a micro level, emphasis focused on the economic foundation of socialism of the state organized enterprises. So from 1979 to the 1980s, the Chinese government was preoccupied with incentivizing state enterprises. And they had decided to allow them to keep some of the profits and manage them. But it actually worked out for the best to start with a decentralization program because it was very useful and it got everyone involved. And then, of course, since if good results were happening, that would mean immediate promotion within the party, the one-party political system that controlled everything. So, of course, it incentivized many people to try to get the economy going again. So the other way that this happened, and what really got the economy up and running, were the four marginal revolutions that ushered in capitalism. And they provided the forces for a new economic transformation. Now, none of them were Beijing led. These marginal reforms had no influence on socialism. Gladly left alone, they posed no threat to state or downside on the CCP's power, the Communist Party of China's power. But they did give room to the marginal revolutions to embed entrepreneurship and market forces into China again. And this is one of the key themes when you look at the economy. There has to be a certain embeddedness of these theories and ways that the capitalist system uses. And it was very difficult for many people in China. They had a very long-running distrust of capitalism and also market-oriented economies. So these four the TVEs, and that was the township, village, and enterprise system. That's number two. They were industrialized operations located in rural areas. So again, you see, that's correct also, to start up in the rural areas, start capitalism up in the rural areas. That was a good move. So in the first 2 decades, they were the most dynamic sector in the Chinese economy, operating outside state plan with no guaranteed access to state-controlled raw materials. It meant that TVEs had to purchase raw materials sometimes on the black market at higher prices, and they were also denied access to state-controlled distribution system to sell their profits. So I'm getting ahead of myself here. So first of all, in the beginning, the TVEs, the reason they were so successful is because all the communes had been closed. Deng Xiaoping made sure they were shut down, and I think by 1984 or 86, from going from 50,000 communes at one point, where an average size one was around 30,000 people, there were only something like 237 or 234 left. And that's quite a change. So, but what happened is later on, what happened is the people that had controlled a lot of the communes, they also they also invested in these TVEs, these businesses that they were rural based, that they always based in a township or a village by the name of that village or the township. And of course, lots of the people living in rural areas, they still trusted the government, even though there had been a huge famine, things like that. And they were very cautious because at one time Mao had instituted an open forum so people could discuss everything that was wrong with the system. And then, of course, when he found out what everyone really thought, he had a purge, just like the Russians used to do. He had a purge as well. And so, people are always very cautious. Everybody in China still, they never know when things will change. So they're always very cautious. And then what did happen later with the TVEs, they became outside of the structure of the collective and the commune, the former commune. And they were basically forced to run private businesses. And that's where came that comment near the end where they would be cut out of the government system, where they could go through and get special clearances for certain things. And then you see here on the private farming, here's the private farmer there with his ducks and his scythe, and he's looks like life is good for him. He's got 4 ducks there. So, and then also the special economic zones, and you'll hear more about those later. And you see them in that picture on the picture there on the right side. They originally started out just with those that are pictured in there, and they later came on to go to other locations. But what it was, these were marginal offerings, but they made the biggest transformation. That one part, the income coming in from TVEs was greater than the income that was coming in from all the other business in China. So Chinese capitalism, bottom-up process, driven by the 4 marginal revolutions. So TVEs were forced into being enterprising. TVEs hired salespeople to travel all over China, seeking markets for their products. Now, this, of course, was later on. And then when they formed these in the rural areas, they were actually doing some manufacturing in the rural areas, but it was light manufacturing. So they were forced to operate like real business, unlike many of the state sector companies. They soon outperformed state enterprises, and despite all of their privileges and state protections, the SOEs were not enterprising enough under the umbrella of a state sector with very deep pockets. This is why they had to institute the social credit system, because China had no way of loaning money to people. I mean, usually people in the communes and the TVEs, they were given money basically to disperse it in their area and their province. So it was kind of like a foreign concept to think that you could earn your own money. So when things opened up, and then what happened was in these TVEs, they would they would uh, they would have like franchises. They would franchise out to other people that would be willing to go through them, since they had the rights to do all this. And the individual people, when they went through them, they felt more secure also. They were going through a commune system. People were still attached to it. So the growth of private businesses. Now, under Mao, 17 million middle school graduates from ages 15 to 18 years from the city, they were sent to the countryside. Now, this happened in the Cultural Revolution. They were creating so much havoc, roving gangs of teenagers, you know, that trying to get everyone to practice the revolution, that Mao had to send some of them out of the city. And so he sent a whole group of them, 17 million, I think it was. And he sent them out to the countryside to live with the peasants and learn from the peasants. And then there you see a picture of one of the communes in this slide that was closed during Deng's time. So imagine, look at this. Wake up every morning and trudge off into this field and have to do this. And then you see what some of the students had to do there. The sent down, they call them the sent down youth. They were stacking corn in Northeast Province in this picture to the right. It looks like they're stuck in a corn maze almost. So when they eventually returned to the city after Mao's death in 1976, the government, of course, always had planned full employment for everyone. Well, times were still, they were still getting up and going at that time. And they couldn't really find jobs for a lot of these people that had spent, some of them had spent 10 years and more out working with the peasants. And these were educated children from cities. They call them the send down youth. So when they returned, there was mounting pressure for the government to allow self-employment for them because they had suffered greatly. And of course, the government more or less said, well, go start your own business. And a lot of them opened up shops in the city. And then soon these private shops in the cities came to replace state monopolies with their market-based urban economics. They were much better shopkeepers than some shopkeepers that were basically just biding time in a state monopoly shop. So unexpected anomalies appeared in the early TV transition period as well. Self-employed barbers had higher incomes than surgeons in state hospitals. I mean, this is because the rates of pay for the people that had state-held jobs, they really didn't make much money. But then again, in the communist system, the wealth was not so much a function of how much money you made, because first of all, there was very seldom anything to buy. But those people that were Communist Party members and that also were successful in society at that time, they had access to certain goods and certain things that other people didn't have access to because of that privilege. So street vendors even earned more than nuclear scientists. The pay rate for nuclear scientists wasn't that great, I guess. And surgeons didn't get that much either. But if somebody was able to go pick up some manufactured goods in the East, bring them back to the villages and sell them off at a good price, they became quite wealthy. So traders, small shop, and private restaurant owners were among some of the highest income groups in China at that time. Self-employed home businesses and single proprietorships grew from 140,000 in 1978 to 2.6 million by 1981. But then that's just scratching the surface. This is China. You have big numbers like that all the time. So special economic zones, the most controversial, that was mainly because they were established to co-opt capitalism and save socialism. So as an experiment with market economy, targeting overseas Chinese to relocate their factories to these zones to import advanced technology and acquire managerial know-how with free on-the-job training. In the military, they call this OJT, while selling goods on top of that to global markets and creating jobs to stimulate economic growth. So this was where a huge core of managers learned how to be capitalist by having work in these special economic zones. So that's why experiments were they were also confined to a few enclaves, strictly controlled so as not to undermine socialism elsewhere. And if the experiment failed, damage to socialism would be negligible since nobody was able to see it. It was on a seaside enclave. So there were no viewers from the ocean, and there were very few viewers peeking in from the land, it seems. Okay, so this is moves on to a time now when Deng Xiaoping he was the first post-Mao leader, and intersection of regional and national markets reshaped by reforms. And then, Deng Xiaoping was very fond of a lot of quotes. I put some here in this slide, as you can see, and especially when he says, "Poverty is not socialism. To be rich is glorious." And this is how he got basically a lot of people to line up behind him and with his effort. And he was always promoting it as individuals weren't getting rich. It was the nation was becoming wealthy. And then he also said at one time that reform is China's second revolution. So he was very much into passing reforms and always looking for new ways to make capitalism grow. And then another one of his famous sayings was, "Cross the river by feeling for stones." And of course, that takes a long time to do. So anything in China that is really done, where they do it right and do it successfully, it sometimes takes a long time to do. So we see a tale of two reforms continues. So the presence of two reforms was a defining feature of Chinese economic transition, and failure to separate both was a source of confusion to understanding Chinese reforms. Beijing, of course, officially claimed itself to be state-centered account of reform, so projecting itself as an omniscient designer and an instigator of reform. But many unseen forces contributed to pushing forth market mechanisms to best effect. So helping give party and nation a competent face in reacting to keep up with China's rapidly increasing growth. And survival instincts were the first priority of the Chinese Communist Party. The CCP survived market reform because they monopolized political power. So always active in the economy as well. And so they always had to look like they were the ones instituting the changes. And even you see in the past month, the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party took place. And all kinds of things were done. And most of all, it was always to remind people that all of these changes were being brought to you by communism. So this is not unlike what I mentioned when we were discussing Germany. And when I talked about Bismarck eventually instituted the social welfare net. And he did this just to make sure that the socialists would not get credit for it, because it was happening. It was starting to happen, from a grassroots level. So he did that to steal the fire. So it's the same thing here. The communists all of a sudden are becoming specialists at market-driven economics, and they institute all these changes. Now, a lot of this, of course, it was just like, putting your finger in the dike to stop the flow. I mean, there's so many things were happening, and it wasn't until the 90s when they really kicked in full steam. But up before then, it was all happening in the countryside, where all these institutions like the TVE, they started in the countryside, and you had a rural capitalism that was ongoing. And it was just, peasants were tickled just to think that they were able to make money when all they ever had to do before was just till the land. And then a lot of those people that had other talents took this as an opportunity to open up businesses and not be on the land farming. Okay, now the second part of our, let me say this also about, by doing this, the Communist Party, it helped to sell their statist account of reform. But, and not only by the marginal revolutions had brought entrepreneurship and market forces back to China, but in the first decade of reform, the Chinese government was too busy trying to save the state sector. Okay, the second part of our tale began 1992 after Deng Xiaoping's Southern tour. Now, it was a regional competition that transformed China into a market economy by the end of the 1990s. And it existed in the 1980s until trade barriers at provincial borders were set up and split China's economy. So you, like I said, you have to envision it as, 23 different states. So just think if you had like 23 different countries that were all trading seriously back and forth together, you would have a union of a lot of success and support from each other in it. And that was what was happening in China at earlier times. But then I guess some of the provinces wanted more taxes, and they started charging things like that. And that's what Deng Xiaoping did in 1992. He went out with another round of reforms to give rise to a common national market, bringing market discipline back to all economic actors. And we can get a better look into some of what was happening with these TVEs and also the rural capitalism that was taking place, and how over time it was changing. So take a look at here, and you'll see from 1994 on. Now, again, by 1994, you saw a lot of businesses getting out of a lot of the rural capitalists were getting out because it was still connected. Most of the TVs were still connected with the countryside. So they were starting to do other businesses. And that's where you see those comments that were made earlier about the these TVs not having access to the state system. They're getting out. So let's look at here. Basically, you want to look at this far left column, the level of employment between urban employed persons, state-owned units, collectively owned units, and private enterprises. And these were different sets of businesses. Now, if you look all the way over to the far right column, you will see the increase and decrease across the board for these four sections. And you see and you can see the trend. Okay, so let's look at state-owned units. That's the second row. And you go all the way to the right and you see minus 468%. So in other words, the TVEs were on their way out by the 1990s. They had really served their purpose to get rural capitalism moving in the 80s and the late 70s. They did a great job. But by now, people were looking more toward private businesses. So, and then the third row, which is collectively owned units, those were the original TVEs. And you see 11.02% decline. So people had left them and were getting out of them. Now, a lot of that traffic that was leaving that area was going over to the privatized industry, the privatized sector of the economy. And you can see that by looking at, urban employed persons. That's the first column. Small increase, 3.17%. But that was largely from a lot of the people that were coming from poorer provinces in the east or in the west that were coming to the large cities to work there in the factories. And then, but look at the bottom column, you'll see private enterprises. And again, 21% increase. So that's where the growth was taking place back then. And then some facts that you see here in the orange section. So chart of data and growth rates suggest the character of the 1990s Chinese economy. Just as I said, urban employment increased by great migration from opportunist cities. Urban area employment grew even quicker, driven by the same factor as city-bound labor. And SOEs were systematically cutting headcount near 15%. This was a huge problem. These state organized enterprises, they had to cut back their payroll. These people were just getting money sometimes for not doing anything. They might have a job, say, delivering coal. All of a sudden, they stopped delivering coal. They still got paid. They paid them by the month. So systemically, they were cutting the headcount near 15% a year at that time also. And then it was a gradual manner due to a large number of people affected and the reform pace. Now, collectively owned units substituted for TVEs at the same time. And a huge decline in TVE employment noted in the 1990s second half was more than 11%. So conversely, private enterprise grew dramatically. And then here's another, this is just to show an indication of hybrid firms, which were like partial state owned and then partial privatized, and then pure state, and then also pure private. And you see the three of them here. And so of all of them, the hybrid ones seem to work the best because I had some affinity with the state there. They had some contact with them. And the pure state sectors seem to decline. See how they took a bump up in the middle and then went down. Whereas pure private started to go up then, all the way up into 2014. So that was a trending area for the time. So the pure traditional state SOEs, and they were not doing as well. And then there's some other notes there on the bottom that really don't amount to too much right there. But the pure, it's just to notice basically this slide is to notice what you see happening, the trends happening in employment over time periods. Okay, now let's talk about some of the TVEs. And this is pretty interesting, as I was talking about, because you can see, look at these upward increases here. And they're talking about here, like the first one on the top. This is the number of TVEs by the millions. Look at the increase up until 1993, when up in the 90s, the late 90s, they just started to tail off. But you see, they had a huge increase from the early 1980s up until 1986. And then another increase up until the early 90s. And then they started to tail off. So for instance, from 1980 to 1988, China's rural industrialization grew at unprecedented levels due to the TVE introduction and development. Other Asian nations, rural industrialization never even came close to Chinese TVEs, unmatched growth rates and results. So the official statistics from 1978 to 1994, the average annual growth of rural industrial output is 27%. That's quite a bit, nearly 3 times annual national GDP. So then the rural industry, the next point here as well, the rural industry surpassed agricultural in size in 1987, and it later comprised half of the total Chinese economy. That's really unbelievable. And by 1986 to 1998, the TVE average asset scale increases tenfold, with average state or annual growth points near 25%. Okay, so here's another section. You can see again here. This is the share in national output and industrial output. And the share in national output, they're leading the way behind some of the industrial output. The industrial output is slow. Eventually, it catches up to the TVEs. And then on the bottom, you see the real income per capita and the contribution of the TVEs with the blue line. And the TVE is contributing all of it. You see the general curve going up, but it's all related to the TVEs, the township and village enterprises. So collective ownership dominated across the country. 1984 with 67.46% TVE employment and 85.63% of TVE output, coming from collectives. So like I say, they were considered as part of the collective because the collective was the one that had bought up all the rights to these TVEs and used to lease them out to people, hardworking peasants that wanted to make money. They would lease them out. So production factors. So TV ownership was characterized, production factors, land, labor, capital, materials, etc., were community owned, divided equally among all. No one had complete ownership. So that was another reason they declined, because you didn't really know who owned them. They were owned by the state, but by being a member of the collective, you also owned it as well. So it made a lot of people feel very secure to be in that relationship rather than taking a chance on a private industry. So no mobility of production factors out of the community existed. Capital accumulation and fundraising restricted to town or villages and conducted on local levels. Now, community members could not transfer rights to their TVE property. If they left the community, they automatically lost their property share. Wages or public services allotted to all by local government controlling the TVE profit accumulation. And local governments ran production, management, distribution of TVEs, treating collective TVEs as public property. So there was a really blurred line here between the public and the private, but it worked unexpectedly for a long time. So let's look at the last one on the TVEs here, the last slide. And again, the unprecedented development of the private rural enterprises kept pushing growth higher. And you see on that first graph at the top, you have that one line up there in the 60 to 80 percentile. That's very good. That has to do with the labor force in private TVEs. They employed a large part of the population. So in 1984, there were 4.2 million private rural enterprises, accounting for 69.28% in the total number of TVEs, while they accounted for 23.54% of TVE employment and 14.37% of TVE output. But 1 year later, the private rural enterprise surged to 10.37 million, and 84.87 of the total TVEs at that time accounted for 38% of the total rural labor. Now, the percentage of their output and TVE output value increased by more than 10 points to about, see 6 and 7 here, these 2 points, you look at them because you can see what it contributed to. It's way up on the scale, over 60%. And again, I didn't really understand much about these TVs. It's always something very hard to understand. And I finally ran across something right near the end of my research for this presentation, but it helped me get a greater understanding of it. Okay, so let's see. Right, so that's about it. We're near the end. And I have one more slide. So this has to do, of course, with capitalism with Chinese characteristics. And that's exactly what it was. The Chinese have taken capitalism and they've infused their persona and their culture into it. And now, finally, after 40 years, it's embedded in the culture. So Communist Party of China fused capitalism with socialism, and a new model, unlike Asia's four small tigers, those were Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan, and South Korea, with its own China. They have their own Chinese character and their economic system. So the CCP, with a socialist core, controlled China's market-oriented capitalist experience, now birthing it into the state capitalism of 1997 at the 15th Congress as a trade-off. Now, I'm not talking so much about this now, but the subject comes up in a review of what I'm talking about here. So turning point to private, but state-owned. So any business in China is basically has a CCP cell member in the business. You can't have a business in China without someone from the Communist Party knowing what's going on in that business. Just not possible. So China's privatization introduced a market-based system, but it was a tactical privatization, never a policy goal by itself, but a tool to reduce numbers of the smaller SOEs, to let go of the small ones, basically. That's what the saying goes later. You'll see in the next grouping. So it helped CCP members keep political and economic control of vital economic sectors, reducing and also ending some of them. State subsidies and state liabilities were also reduced and some ended to small SOEs to refocus on leaner and cleaner state power, limited exposure. Excuse me. So grasping the big and letting go of the small. This was a tactic used to grasp the big SOEs and the most important part of state capitalism, which needed to restructure, consolidate, and strengthen China's largest SOEs at the expense of the smaller ones. In the late 1990s, privatization programs reduced operational and managerial complexities across the board. Which greatly favored, excuse me, larger SOEs and went against the smaller ones. So what was really happening? They were making their national champions. These, excuse me, these SOEs that would take large parts of the economy. So privatizing numerous labor-intensive, smaller individual SOEs left them with no social protection in place, causing massive unemployment, social instability, and wrenching human costs, such as increasing inequality. This was still happening. As all this wealth was coming to China, some inequality was growing. At the same time, Chinese state tightened political and security controls to suppress any possible dissent. A huge reallocation of financial, human, and managerial resources from small to larger SOEs occurred. Myriads of small firms were abandoned by state officials to refocus only on a few national champions. So that talks about the reforms that were happening in the 90s, as all of a sudden we saw China moving more toward a state capitalism, which had extremely wealthy companies that were controlling large segments of certain sectors. Okay, so that's about it. We have room for questions now, if anyone has any.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very interesting presentation, especially the short little video at the beginning. I think it was quite interesting, because to me, it's not only a vindication of Adam Smith, but also Henry George, because it just shows you what happened to an economy when people are allowed to keep what they produce. I think that was a good example.
Yeah,
So,
thank you, Ibrahim. You know, you're exactly right. And I mean, what happened is when they had more private farming, when private farming came online, what happened was that the peasants, the farmers got to choose what to plant and how to work it. And that didn't happen on the communes.
and plus a good chunk of the produce was being confiscated, right?
Yeah, but the irony was they were being confiscated because the managers that feared for their life when they didn't meet the quotas, they
Yeah.
pushed them up.
Mhm.
So oddly enough, that's what led to the famine. All the food, the the party members in the provinces and in charge, they thought, well, give us a little bit more of the harvest since you did so well. And there ended up being not enough food in the countryside. And the irony was that the farmers that grew the food were dying of famine. You know, similar to like what happened in Ireland, you know, because of the potato. The Irish only ate potatoes. So when they were still shipping the food to England while the potato famine was going on, and they were hoping it would get better, it never did. Same situation happened here. You saw the same thing happen with Stalin in the Ukraine when he did large scale communes as well. It happened in the 30s. They had a famine there. Even Hoover, I think, was an engineer. He went to Soviet Union to help run some operations there to feed the starving people.
I think that's exactly what Wayne was mentioning somewhere in the chat at the beginning. So let's open it for Q&A. If you have questions, please go ahead. You should be able to unmute yourselves. I see Yanis raising his hand. Yanis, go ahead.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Ibrahim. I wanted to pick up from the last point of the discussion, which was about the quotas, which were like obviously not managed well. They were like too big. And I was wondering what the central government did with those quotas. I understand that they starved the farmers, but actually, did the urban populations need them? Did they export them? What did they do with this surplus that they confiscated?
So what's the question again? In short, in other words, about the quotas. Well, I think what happened is that they really started to do something about that, because what happened when the people in the city were not getting enough food, and the quotas, they just didn't work out. They never met lots of times they just never met the quotas. I mean, you saw that picture of that huge commune. It's just it takes a lot to organize such an endeavor that large, and a lot of wasted energy is moved in just organizing to get the thing moving.
So in other words, what that system did was actually disincentivize farmers from producing more. Then the managers over confiscated, and then everybody starved. Is that a good summary of that system of quotas?
Well, that's what happened until the Chinese village tried an experiment that really proved, even to the Communist Party leadership, that this is time to really change. Okay,
Yeah,
it was authoritarian. It was taking away people's freedom, and it was confiscating what they were producing, and it was, more or less leading to the famines that they were trying to avoid. So what happened in that Chinese village, that little experiment, it's when peasants were allowed to produce whatever they want, to decide how to do it, and all they needed to do is just to give whatever the government asked for, and the rest they were going to own it. So production changed from within a year, I believe, from 10 tons to 65 tons. Look at that difference, sixfold.
So this reminds me of Arthur Laffer's, curve, where he says that actually with less taxation, because that's what the confiscation was by the central government, with less taxation, actually you can have a more affluent society. And I think
that's
And
the
I think
very,
that's a lesson. It's amazing that the
uh-huh,
Chinese communist paradigm
uh-huh.
confirms Laffer's, draw it on the back of an envelope graph.
Well, it
It's
was on
amazing.
a napkin, but
On a
anyway,
napkin, yeah. Same thing.
Laffer's example is good, but I don't know if that was really the intention behind it. Laffer just wanted a tax cut for the wealthy, and you also have
No. That's not true. I mean, that's what the enemies of Laffer say. Like the government monopolies because they want more taxes. But the point is that with fewer taxes, the economy becomes more productive because people have more incentive to
yeah.
produce more, and then the
That's
surplus benefits everyone. That's Laffer's
that's that's
argument, and that's
that's
what the Chinese example proved.
That's exactly the George's point. That's why I mentioned that the example there vindicates Henry George, because George is not just saying a tax cut. He said just take away taxes away from production. So in this example, the tax was taken away and the people produced more. So once Deng Xiaoping saw that, normally that is something that would be punished under normal circumstances by the death penalty. But he didn't do it. He said, you know what? This is an example. This is an out-of-box example that proves capitalism can be good. You know, the lesser taxes that you have, the less confiscation you have, you basically unleash people's abilities to produce. That's exactly what they did. They just nationalized the experiment that happened in a small village.
And it was done out of desolation.
Yeah,
They had no choice because they were always begging. The people in that village always, they were well known in the province as the beggars that never grew enough food. And they decided to do something about it themselves. And they took they took it into their hands. And 8 years later, they did that 1979, actually 78, 79. So 8 years later, by 1986, I think all the 96% of they called them the brigade teams, that was in the socialist setup at the time, the production units, they were all doing it that way, like the private responsibility, the household responsibility plan, what they called it. And then Deng's came to see it, and he used that right away for it changed the countryside, the rural reforms. People all elected to use that.
Good. It looks like Yuan has a question, Michael.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Wayne. I just want to make a mention. Someone mentioned Herbert Hoover visiting Russia. Actually, he did, but only in the first famine I referred to, right in the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, and he did do a lot of relief work there. By the time Stalin started the second famine in the 1930s, Hoover was president, and he really was not directly involved. That's all.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's great to have someone that reads history listening, that's for sure.
Any other questions or comments? We have 7 more minutes. I don't know if Ed Dodson is here tonight. Let me check that. Michael, it looks like that's all we have.
No, I have, if nobody else has a question, I have a second question.
Okay, after Yanis, there is Yen. So Yen
Okay,
will go after
I will defer to Yen because Yen hasn't asked. So I will ask after Yen.
All right, go ahead, Yen.
Okay, thanks. I was going to ask is that what was the CCP member that was a representative in the companies? What was his responsibilities and authorities within the company operations?
Good question.
Yeah, the Chinese businesses, they're like a maze. It's really hard to find anything out like that. But the CCP member, his job is just to be there to make sure that someone reports back to the authorities about what's going on in the business. It's like a spy on the business, that's all.
That's what I would assume. They want to make sure
they might
know
be
everything.
Might be getting a pay scale to do something, but they're just there to keep tabs on you.
Well, do they make sure that, are they kind of like policing it? So they make sure that nobody steals from the company, or does he asking for bribes in order to not report things?
You know, it's not something they write books about.
Okay.
You know, it's nobody wants to write. They don't write that information out there. You know, someone would probably knock on the door if they told too much.
Okay.
All right. Ed Dodson is here. Ed wants to ask a question.
My question is, what about the practice of sending their young people to learn business practices at Harvard or the Wharton School or London School of Economics? To what extent did the government look upon that as a strategy that should be publicly funded?
Well, there's a lot of students that, you know, there's no shortage of students that come from China. You know, a lot of them were coming like for high school, so that they could graduate from a high school that would give them a much better chance to get into a university. So they would come to the US, say junior year of high school, and spend 2 years to prepare for the college, and then also just to be able to get into you know, in older times, you know, if you went to a state university, you could establish residency within 2 years, and if you had been there for 2 years, you could go to state school. I remember, like when I was graduated from high school, I was in Montana, so I could go to 3 different state schools for residence tuition because my father was in the military, and both my parents were each from a different state, and I could have done that. And I mean, in those days, the education was great. And now also the Chinese, they send students out and they come back, and, you know, they have a huge manager class that, you know, they had to send them out to learn about capitalism. And that was ongoing for the longest time.
I think that should be Alan, right? Add that.
Does that, yeah, I think,
Yes.
does that answer your question? I think so. I don't know.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about, follow up on the taxation question, idea that, so if you said that relieving taxation helped to increase production. So what is the current status of federal taxation in China? Is there a great deal of income? Is there income tax, or just the overall condition of or does government issue money? As I teach, government does not need to, federal government doesn't need taxes in order to fund spending, but what is the state of federal taxation in China?
Well, I do know that, like, there were different times when Deng Xiaoping was in power, and certainly a little bit thereafter, the taxes were lowered, and of course, because they were trying to get a consumer society going. So they wanted to have more money out there in the hands of people so they could spend it. But in general, I mean, you know, the Chinese are very frugal. They always keep something aside so that if taxes go up, they're able to manage that. And then, you know, and when we talk about Henry George, we have to also realize too that China, as a country, they're one of the few that leases out land. You know, the government effectively owns most of the land, but yet recently, a lot of young professional Chinese have been buying homes, and that's been going on for 10 years or more now. And I don't really know, I haven't looked into that much, but they feel if there's a purchase they make, that's the first big purchase they'll make, because they never know. You never know when things could go wrong again. And you know, there's a lot of people there in China have a lot of tragedy in their lives. You know, earthquakes, floods, things like that. They're very normal. But I can't really tell you much more about the taxes than that. I really haven't. It's not something I've looked into.
Well, the highest rate is somewhere around, if you make like a million renminbi, that's a yuan, it's about 45%.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Mhm.
So they do have an income tax.
They do, yes.
So
Federal
they have
income.
progressive taxation.
Yeah. So it just depends on the incomes. It starts from 3% to 45%.
And what about sales taxes at the local levels?
Well, I'm not a specialist in Chinese taxation. I don't I don't know about all those little details.
Yeah.
That's something to look into. But as Michael said, land at least is an asset that is owned by a government. People can lease it. So land values there tend to benefit more the community through the state than to individuals.
And, you know, with the huge population of farmers, which China has, and also with the ability to contract a good piece of land to raise a good crop, I know only 10% of the whole countryside, the whole country has arable land. So it's a small part. So there's a lot of money to be made in leasing land out, you know, for crops, things like that. And even they have also these companies in China that are agriculture companies. They will come in and use the land for you and do much better than you could do yourself because they're set up for that. They're large agricultural companies that come in to get the most out of land. So if someone owns land and is not getting much out of it, probably one of these companies comes by to suggest that you should use their services, and lots of people do. And it works out quite well.
Great. Yanis, you get to have the last word. It's 8:01.
You, I wanted to ask about the down youth shops that, and you mentioned that they were able to replace the state-owned shops, and I'm wondering, were there any price controls? Was there inflation? Like, can you tell us a little bit about price controls in general, but in particular also for those shops that emerged after the youth came back?
Well, you know, I just know it was a huge, a huge number of these youths that went there, and some of them stayed for like a decade or longer, and you know they couldn't pick up their lives again when they came back, and they, you know, it was hard to get into any training for anything else. So it was large cities, mainly like Shanghai, and they just opened up stores there, and simply because you were like a shopkeeper and you smiled when people came in and did the right thing. Like I know in a lot of these stores, like when I was traveling around the East Block, and even when I was in China for about a month there, and it was quite amazing. You know, you have to wait for the longest time, like just to get a hotel room. You know, they tell you, oh, just sit down and wait there. And then I already knew this one place I was going to. I had heard from other travelers. I talked with them. I said, you know, go there. The rates are good. And, you know, when they tell you to wait, just go find a room. Get the room, take the key from the door, come up and tell them you put your things in that room and you locked it up. That's what people would do when you're traveling. Instead of, they just tell you to sit down and wait. And that's generally what happens in a lot of socialist countries. You know, you don't have a great service class there. You know, I mean, when in Russia one time, we were all waiting outside a restaurant, and when we got in, we waited about half an hour or more. And when we got in, there were 2 empty tables in there, tables for about 10 people each. I couldn't believe it. And I asked the waiter, and he said, oh, the waiter that runs those 2 tables, he's off. He's not working tonight. So that was the type of labor that they had in a socialist society.
Interesting.
That forces everybody to socialize, right? If you have one table for 10.
Yeah. Well, you know, you're going to be paid the same amount no matter what you do.
Right.
That's why even in that video,
Mhm.
it said that everyone was excited about it. Even the old people, if they could still walk, would come and help, you know?
Interesting. Anyway, so I believe that's it for tonight, Michael. Thank you very much. And thank you all for attending tonight. And We hope to see you on Wednesday because we have a new class starting with Alana Hartsock. And also on Monday, the coming Monday, Ted Gordney is going to start his class on assessing land values. So we hope you already registered. If not, you could go on the website and click on the link and you'll be in. Thank you very much and have a good night.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good night.